Look at these maps of wars over the last 200 years in Europe, and you'll see a few countries that clearly didn't participate. And you're probably thinking of Switzerland, but Sweden has also been neutral in every conflict since 1814. It might sound odd today, but Sweden was once a powerful empire, and no, I'm not talking about the Vikings. In the 1600s, they once controlled Finland, Estonia, and parts of what is now Germany, Poland, Norway, and Russia. But in 1809, they lost Finland after suffering a massive defeat by Russia. So they decided they were better off not getting involved anymore. They skipped out on the destruction of World War I and somehow avoided getting entangled in World War II, well, kind of. See, they continued to trade with Germany and had to let Nazi troops pass over their land to access Finland. At the same time, they also traded with the Allies and protected some refugees escaping the Nazis, especially the Danish and Norwegian Jews toward the end of the war. To show how serious they are about neutrality, official foreign policy documents include the words, quote, non-alignment in peace aiming at neutrality in war, quote end. Since World War II, Sweden's official neutrality let it take on the role of conflict mediator over the years. In the late 1960s, for example, it secretly tried negotiating peace in Vietnam by sending messages between the Americans and Vietnamese communists. And in 1975, Sweden was the first Western country to open an embassy in North Korea, which still operates in Pyongyang today. The neutrality policy and reputation as a mediator led to many Swedes taking top positions in the UN over the years, like the second UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. This long history of neutrality continued through the Cold War up to just recently. In a remarkable shift, Sweden has just announced it's finally joining NATO, bringing 200 years of neutrality to an end. You've probably heard of NATO before, but just to make sure we're all on the same page here, NATO is short for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's a US-led military and political alliance of countries in Europe and North America. It was created in 1949 to stop the spread of communism in Europe and defend Western Europe against an invasion by the Soviet Union. What's important is that each member has signed the NATO Treaty, which states in Article 5 that, quote, an armed attack against one shall be considered an attack against them all, quote end. That means if a big country like Russia attacks a small country like Denmark, Denmark can count on the military support and resources of every other NATO country, including the US. In the late 40s, Sweden tried to create a neutral alternative to NATO called the Scandinavian Defense Union. But the US wanted Norway and Denmark to join NATO so they could put military bases on their land and sell them US weapons, so Sweden had to go alone. While NATO seemed to lose relevance after the Cold War ended, the organization has recently become incredibly relevant as Russia invaded parts of Ukraine and continues to threaten other countries. Which brings us back to why Sweden is now taking this drastic step. Let's consider what would happen if Sweden were attacked by another country if they weren't part of NATO. So let's use the example of Russia. If we look at total military personnel, Russia has Sweden outnumbered by an insane margin. Swedish aircraft and tanks are way outnumbered too, although their naval power is pretty decent since they have more patrol vessels. That's critical since the two countries don't share a land border but are both sitting on the Baltic Sea. According to the Swedish military, the country aims to hold off an invasion for around 3 months. After that, if no one comes to help, they might have to trade their Volvos in for Ladas and start speaking Russian. And while neutrality may seem to work for Sweden, what neutral countries probably don't want you to know is that the whole idea of being a neutral country is kind of impossible to pull off. See, to fend off potential invaders, you need enough strength to credibly defend yourself. That's why Sweden makes those awesome Saab fighter jets, and why Sweden has a big arms industry for its size. I mean, it's the world's 14th largest arms exporter despite having a population of just 10 million. To put that into perspective, that's slightly more than the city of Seoul, South Korea, but in an entire country. It's inevitable that to get the best weapons and technology, one small country probably can't provide everything it needs. This is what historians Mikael Nilsson and Marco Wyss call the armed neutrality paradox. To put it simply, you need the best weapons so no one can force you to pick sides, but you still have to pick sides to get these best weapons. So during the Cold War, Sweden's military bought much of their equipment from the US, which meant they agreed to US demands. In many ways, Sweden was more of an informal NATO ally than an outright neutral country. In 1957, US helicopters landed on Swedish territory without permission. Sweden officially protested this violation of their sovereignty, but privately assured the Americans they were obliged to protest to prevent the Soviets from doing the same. This landing seemed like an isolated incident, but in reality, NATO had a secret flight path that passed over the southwest of Sweden all throughout the 50s and 60s, and the Swedish government was well aware of it. Still, the Americans had to avoid violating Sweden's airspace on the east coast, where Soviet radar could easily detect them. It might sound like the US could just push Sweden around whenever it wanted. The Americans asked them to join a secret embargo to stop selling military equipment to communist countries, giving them access to the very best American weapons in exchange. Still, the Americans couldn't just force Sweden to do what they wanted. Sweden consented to their actions, carefully balancing the need to appear neutral while ultimately acting in their best interest. The country had bargaining power because they were an important buffer state between NATO and communist countries. Sweden maintained some level of neutrality for a long time, only officially inching closer to NATO in the past decade. But why remain neutral if it's more for appearances than reality? Well, maintaining the status quo helped Sweden avoid provoking the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet threat disappeared, the question was less whether Sweden should maintain its neutrality than why it needed to have such a big military at all anymore. After the Cold War ended, joining NATO wasn't even on their radar. Sweden actually shrank its military and focused on UN peacekeeping missions abroad, continuing to build on their peaceful image to promote human rights and democracy. When the country joined the EU in 1995, it technically joined a military alliance, but the EU didn't offer much protection compared to NATO. That's because the EU's cooperative defense missions are only outside Europe, and EU military support would require all EU members to agree before sending any help. By 2010, Sweden abolished the draft, and young Swedes no longer had to serve time in the military. The end of the Cold War meant other changes for Europe, like the end of the communist regimes in the East. Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary were once members of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet answer to NATO. But in 1999, they happily joined NATO. The Baltic countries, sitting right on Russia's doorstep, joined in 2004. NATO actually tried to collaborate with Russia on security during the 2000s, but we probably didn't realize how much NATO's expansion alarmed Vladimir Putin until the invasion of Crimea in 2014. The invasion showed that Europe wasn't as stable as we had thought, suddenly changing the equation for both Sweden and NATO as a whole. Sweden changed its defense strategy away from peacekeeping, increasing collaboration with NATO and reinstating the draft in 2018, opening it up to include women. If you look at every year since 2014, Sweden has inched closer to NATO each year, even before public opinion was in favor of joining. In a 2017 report, Sweden's military stated, quote, "Sweden will not remain passive if another EU member state or Nordic country suffers a disaster or an attack. We expect these countries to take similar action if Sweden is affected." Quote end. Though it stated Sweden would need to defend itself for a while before other countries came to its aid. The country also has done a lot to prepare for NATO membership, adopting English as its operational language back in the 90s, becoming a NATO host nation in 2016, and adopting NATO interoperability standards. What that means is standardizing their weapons, training, and procedures so different countries can quickly work together in a crisis. As a host nation, Sweden can more easily help or ask for help from NATO and can host exercises on its soil. After taking so many steps, Sweden was ready to join NATO by the time Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. Once public opinion shifted in favor of joining, the wheels were already moving, and it was only a short leap to become the 31st NATO member alongside Finland. So, while Vladimir Putin might decry yet another country joining NATO, NATO membership is less of a big deal than it's made out to be because Sweden was already so close. And while it was a shock to see 2 centuries of neutrality finally come to an end, there is a very good reason why Sweden and Finland want to join so quickly. In theory, any European country can join NATO. In reality, they have to be invited first and meet certain conditions, like being democracies with market economies and reforming their military to be compatible with NATO. Most importantly though, they can't have any ongoing conflicts, which is a fact that has been exploited by Vladimir Putin before in Georgia in 2008 and now in Ukraine. That means if Sweden gets invaded before joining, it wouldn't be eligible to join NATO and benefit from its collective defense. This is also why Putin publicly warned Sweden against joining, since once they're in NATO, they're a lot harder to invade. Well, there are safety in numbers, especially when you join an organization that calls Russia its #1 threat. Now that the 2 countries are set to join NATO, there's not much Putin can do about it, but that's it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.